Under the warm golden afternoon sun, Jason Collins, an 18-year-old, feels a strange sense of happiness as he walks out of his house. Today is his birthday, and the special gift given by his father, David Collins, has made this day more special than ever. Jason couldn't help but smile as he looked at his German Shepherd, Max. The dog had a sleek black-brown coat, wary ears, and a strong, confident gait. Max is not only a birthday present, but also a loyal friend that Jason has always dreamed of since he was a child. The two had quickly bonded over the course of the past few days, and Jason couldn't help but feel proud to see Max walking beside him, wagging his tail happily. Jason gripped the leash, feeling the firmness and strength from Max as an invisible protection, and the feeling made him feel at peace. He started walking along the quiet street, where there weren't too many people passing by. The neighbors occasionally show a smile and admiring eyes when they look at the big and beautiful dog. Jason feels like a happy and proud owner. A feeling of happiness filled his heart. He knew that this was an important moment marking his maturity. Max is not only a gift, but also a testament to the love and care his father has for him. As he walked, Jason felt joy and satisfaction, as if the whole world was beautiful and full of hope. However, that brief joy was quickly cut short when a police car stopped nearby. Jason heard the engine hiss, and suddenly a feeling of uneasiness rose in his heart. He saw the car door open, and a policeman stepped down. At first, Jason simply thought that the policeman might be on patrol duty, but when he saw his face, a strange and uncomfortable feeling began to creep into his mind. Officer Ray Thompson, the cop, was a familiar face in the neighborhood, but not for good reason. Jason had heard many stories about Thompson, about how he treated the people of the area, especially young people like Jason. Thompson's attitude is always imbued with arrogance and prejudice, which makes Jason feel worried. Despite not understanding why the officer stopped and approached them, Jason felt a sense of restlessness. He held on to Max's leash tighter and tried to stay calm. But when Officer Thompson looked down at Max with intent, a feeling of unease rose in Jason's heart. He felt like something was wrong. All the pride and joy just now seemed to disappear in an instant, replaced by an insecurity, like a storm approaching. Jason stood there, staring at the policeman, a sense of tension filling the space around him. He wanted to say something, but he didn't know where to start. Everything suddenly becomes blurry, and Jason doesn't know what will happen next. Officer Ray Thompson stood across from Jason, his expression full of doubt, and his cold gaze swept from head to toe Max. At this moment, Jason could feel the tension in the air, as if everything was changing in an instant. Thompson's steps seemed heavier, and the question he let go of shook Jason. "How much do you get paid to walk this dog?" Thompson's question was not simply curiosity, but clearly an attack, as if Jason didn't deserve to own a dog like Max. Jason stood still, blinking a few times to make sure he hadn't misheard. "What?" he whispered in his head. The feeling of incomprehensibility and disbelief made him unable to react immediately. He shook his head, feeling the confusion rise in his heart. "Nobody pays me anything," Jason replied, trying to keep his voice calm, even though his discomfort was rising in his heart. His answer came out softly, but inside was a resoluteness that could not be expressed in words. Thompson didn't stop there. He smirked, a laugh not of joy but of ridicule. At this moment, Jason felt the sourness in every word of the policeman. "So this dog is yours, huh? How can you afford this dog?" Thompson asked, his tone still full of sarcasm. Thompson's question is not only a mockery but also an insult, hitting Jason's self-esteem. He didn't understand why a person could have such an attitude. He had tried to do everything right, tried to be nice to Max, and was now being questioned as a criminal. Jason felt a choke in his throat, but he tried to contain the emotion that was surging. He didn't want Thompson to see that he was weak, even though his heart was beating wildly, feeling like something was about to break. "This dog is mine," he said firmly, his voice trembling slightly, but still trying to hold on. "Max is my birthday present from my dad." Jason tried to explain, but his confidence was replaced by anxiety, as Thompson didn't seem to believe his words. A sense of helplessness and confusion engulfs Jason, as he realizes that his words don't seem to have any effect on the cop he is facing. As Thompson continued to laugh mockingly, Jason felt like he was deeply offended. The policeman's gaze was not only suspicious but also contemptuous, which made Jason want to turn away and leave this conversation. But he couldn't because he knew that if he did, Max would be misunderstood. The bond between him and the dog has been built over the past few days. Max is not just a material gift, but a loyal friend, an important part of his life. "How can you raise this dog?" Thompson repeated the question again, but this time his voice was full of menace. Jason felt his blood seem to freeze in that moment. Every word of Thompson was like a knife stab at his self-esteem, and he couldn't understand why a person could behave like that to an innocent person just because they were different. The inexplicable feeling of self-pity and frustration caused Jason's hands to clench. He tried to regain his composure, but Thompson's next words were like adding fuel to the fire. "Then, did you steal this dog?" Thompson asked bluntly, and by this moment, Jason felt all the warmth and happiness he had had before. The whole world seemed to collapse on his head. He tried to protest, but could not utter a word. All the thoughts in his head were chaotic. "No, I didn't steal it." Jason reacted immediately, but his voice trembled, and he couldn't contain the feeling of anger that was rising. "Max is mine. My father gave it to me." But Thompson still didn't believe it. The image of this policeman in control of the situation, with his eyes not leaving Max, made Jason feel pushed into a corner with no way out. Thompson's view is not just skeptical, but now a challenge. Jason felt like he had been pushed into a situation where he had to prove something that he obviously didn't need to prove. The tension in the air was high, making Jason feel like his heart was about to stop. Jason felt like everything around him was spinning, as if time had stopped at that moment. Every word of Thompson was like a powerful punch to his spirit. Thompson's cold gaze made Jason feel like a criminal, even though he had done nothing wrong. The mess in his head made Jason unable to think clearly. He felt his body become heavy, his limbs were sluggish, but he still tried to hold on, not letting the confusion take over him. He couldn't let Thompson win. He couldn't let this policeman misunderstand him anymore. The accusations from Thompson echoed in Jason's head like a vortex from which he could not escape. "Did you steal this dog?" The question kept repeating itself like an obsession, making the feeling of helplessness in him rise strongly. Jason could feel anger burning in his chest, but he tried to stay calm. You can't lose your self-control in this situation, because if you lose your temper, things will get worse. Jason looked at Max, the dog still lying silently next to him, his loyal eyes comforting him in this difficult moment. He suddenly realized that proving Max was not the most important thing. It was important for him to stand up for himself and the dog he loved. He couldn't let Thompson's doubts put him in a weak position. Jason's hand clenched, but not out of anger, but out of determination. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the beating in his chest. Every breath becomes important in this moment. Trying not to shake his voice, he replied with firmness, though there was still a feeling of anxiety inside him. "Max is mine, and I didn't steal it," Jason said, his voice light but determined. He looked into Thompson's eyes, trying to look directly at the person opposite to show the sincerity of his words. But Thompson still didn't seem convinced. His suspicious look made Jason feel like he was ostracized, as if there was no way to prove his innocence. Thompson didn't stop there. He continued to pressure Jason with provocative questions, as if he wanted Jason to confess something. "Are you sure you didn't steal it? Can you afford to take care of it?" Thompson once again scoffed, and that made Jason feel like he was being trampled. Feelings of self-pity, anger, and frustration poured into him, as if a ball had been thrown against a cliff and bounced back. The feeling of not being able to escape Thompson's intrusion made him unable to breathe. Jason tries to hold his ground. "I don't need to explain to you," he said, his voice stronger this time, full of determination. He couldn't let Thompson's suspicions make him waver. "Max is my family. I love it and I'm going to protect it." Those words were like an oath, and though he didn't know if Thompson believed it or not, Jason felt like he had regained some power in this situation. Thompson still didn't stop, but the challenge in his eyes softened somewhat. He was no longer as mocking as before, but his gaze was still full of skepticism. Jason sensed this, but he didn't let it weaken him. His hands were still clenched, his eyes looking at Thompson unblinking, as if he was fighting not only for Max but also for himself. The tension between them hadn't subsided, but Jason realized one thing. He had done the right thing. Even though no one was on his side, no matter how many words of distrust there were, he still maintained his faith in himself and Max. He knew that, no matter how difficult it was, he would not let anyone hurt Max or break this relationship. Max is not just a dog, but a part of his life, a part that he will always protect to the end. Suddenly, Jason realizes that this fight is not only to protect Max, but also to protect who he is. Jason felt like the whole world was falling into this moment. With each passing moment, he felt the tension in the air rise, as if just one wrong action would cause everything to fall apart. Thompson's gaze did not leave him, as if it wanted to penetrate the mind, trying to find a weakness to exploit. Jason felt like a caged animal, unable to escape. Every question, every suspicious look in Thompson's eyes was like a knife slashing into his heart. The feeling of bewilderment resurfaced, but Jason quickly brushed it off. He couldn't allow himself to collapse, he couldn't let Thompson see weakness. He took a deep breath, feeling each air rush into his lungs. There was no room for fear or hesitation in his heart. This answer was not just for Thompson, but for himself, for Max, and for all that he had fought to protect. In fact, Jason had no idea what to do next. He could only think about protecting Max, not letting the dog be separated from him. This scene, with all of Thompson's criticism and questions like arrows aimed at him, made Jason feel like he was being pushed into a corner. He began to wonder if he could really prove his innocence, if he could win this war without anyone on his side. Thompson watched Jason quietly, as if waiting for a collapse. He began to walk closer, walking slowly and meaningfully. Jason felt the overwhelmingness in Thompson's every step, as if he was trying to take over the space, forcing Jason to bow his head. But instead of backing down, Jason stood up straight, his shoulders tensed, his eyes staring straight at Thompson, not the slightest bit of trembling. Jason's whole body was tense. Each muscle seemed to contract in preparation for a long struggle. He could feel every beat of his heart, but the most important thing now was to keep his spirits up. Every movement of Thompson, every question he asks is like a new challenge. And Jason knew that if he could overcome this challenge, he would never let anyone look down on him or Max. Thompson stood closer, his eyes still not leaving Jason. "Do you think you can outrun me so easily?" he said, his voice filled with challenge and contempt. Jason sensed the ridicule in Thompson's words, as if he had decided that Jason could not be innocent, that there could be no reasonable reason for his actions. But Jason couldn't let that lack of trust falter him. Everything he had done, everything he had gone through to be able to protect Max was too important to be defeated by such an absurd interrogation. Jason blinked resolutely. "I'm not who you think I am," he replied. This time his voice not only strong but also determined. He is no longer a person of weak days, days of fear and running away. He has become a person who is willing to stand up for what he loves, willing to fight for justice. Thompson paused, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if reassessing Jason's words. A moment of silence passed between the two of them. The air seemed to thicken, thick with tension. Jason felt every breath he breathed, every second passing like drops of water slowly falling on a rock. Each drop could change everything. Part of Jason wanted to jump in to explain more clearly, but he knew he couldn't. "I said enough." The words had been spoken, and he could only hope that Thompson would understand, or at least, do nothing but let him and Max go. Thompson finally turned around, a hint of concession in his eyes. There was no complete trust, but it seems that there was a part of Thompson that began to doubt his hasty conclusions. Jason didn't know what would happen next, but he felt a glimmer of hope in his heart, as if this war was not over. He did not lose, and he would never let Max fall into anyone's hands, no matter what happened. Jason felt the tension in the air rise and rise, as if everything around him was being pushed to a limit of no return. Thompson's eyes were no longer mere suspicion but now probing, as if he was trying to find every gap in Jason's words. Each of Thompson's questions is not just a challenge to the truth, but a psychological battle that Jason is forced to face. In fact, deep down, Jason wasn't sure about everything. Is Max really safe? Is what he is doing right or not? He felt a gentle sense of uneasiness enveloping him, as if there was something unresolved, some crack that he hadn't noticed. But Jason didn't allow himself to back down. He had to stand his ground, not allowing Thompson's suspicions to shake his confidence. Thompson's gaze didn't leave him, as if they were scrutinizing the slightest gesture, every movement of Jason's hand, or his breath, as if to catch any trembling. Jason took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He looked down at his hands. They were clenched into fists, his knuckles aching from the pressure, but he couldn't let go. This is not the time to show weakness. He needed to keep his composure, no matter how many doubts swirled around him. Thompson smirked, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of sarcasm, of the man who thought he had all the cards. "Do you really think you can deal with me, Jason?" Thompson's voice was like a sharp knife, slashing straight into Jason's mind. Every word he says is full of implications, like an unavoidable challenge. Jason could feel the tension in him, but he couldn't let himself appear weak. He raised his head, his eyes staring directly at Thompson, without a moment's hesitation. "I'm not one to be easily subdued," he replied, his voice resounding, firmer and stronger than ever. That feeling, the feeling of being at the helm of one's own life, gradually returned. Jason knew that if he didn't keep his consistency now, things would fall apart. He also knew that not everyone would understand him, would stand by him, but he couldn't let that waver over him. No matter who didn't believe him, no matter who questioned his actions, what he was doing was for Max's sake, for the safety of his beloved dog, and for his own conscience. Thompson didn't say anything more, but his smile didn't disappear. It seemed that he was waiting for a mistake, an embarrassment, to be able to continue to expose Jason. But Jason didn't allow that to happen. Each of his answers must be carefully calculated. Not a single detail can be missed. He looked into Thompson's eyes, fearless, and didn't let fatigue or stress overwhelm him. "You can try to get to know me as long as you want, but the truth hasn't changed," Jason said, his voice steadfast, but with a hint of fatigue. Rationally, he knew that this conversation would not end easily. Thompson won't give up so easily, and he has a lot of work to do. But he couldn't let himself fall. Each of Thompson's words was like an attack, but Jason felt the power within himself growing, a power that came not only from the body but also from within. Jason thought of Max. That dog, with his loyal eyes and unconditional love, was always there for him when he needed it most. Max's presence has made him stronger. He couldn't let everything fall into Thompson's hands. Not just for himself, but for Max, for the safety of a life he had been protecting all along. Jason took a deep breath, raising his head. He knew that nothing was certain, but the only thing he could do was not give up. This fight is not over, and no matter how much Thompson wants to force him, Jason will stand his ground. He will not let go. The feeling of tension is still like an underground wave engulfing Jason, but he doesn't allow it to take over him. Every second passed like a challenge, a moment when he had to fight not only with the opponent in front of him but also with the fear in his heart. Jason realized that, if he didn't act quickly, if he didn't keep his mentality, he would fall into the trap that Thompson had set. Facing someone as vulnerable as Thompson is not easy, but Jason understands that if he lets himself show any signs of anxiety, it will only make Thompson stronger. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. Fatigue surrounds him, but he can't let it control him. Each of Thompson's questions was like a stab in Jason's mind. Each time he answered felt like a knife cut into his flesh, but he was forced to continue. "Do you really believe that you can escape what is coming?" Thompson's voice rang out again, this time with a clear contempt. His eyes stared at Jason, as if looking for weakness in his every movement, every smile, every silence he made. Jason knew Thompson didn't just want answers. He was looking for signs of fear. People like Thompson live by seeing others shake, and they nourish themselves by watching their opponents fall. And if Jason lets himself fall into that trap, if he lets him see the embarrassment, then it's all over. You can't let that happen. He knew that every decision he made now would decide everything. Actually, I don't care if you believe it or not, Jason replied, his voice cold, without a hint of trembling. He has learned that in situations like this, silence is the biggest enemy. Any change in the way he talks, any action, even the slightest, can be instantly recognized by Thompson. Jason couldn't allow himself to be weak, because if he did, he would lose everything. Thompson's gaze became colder, but Jason didn't take his eyes off him. He felt the tension in the air, but he didn't allow himself to be distracted. The feeling of anxiety in his heart rose, but he was forced to put it aside. He thought of Max, of the dog he had promised to protect at all costs. Max's steadfastness, his unwavering loyal eyes, was the biggest motivation for him to hold on. Jason knows full well that he can't keep sweating in every confrontation like this. He can't let himself get caught up in these psychological games. You have to act, not only to protect himself but also to protect Max, to prove that what he did was right. "I'm not afraid of you," Jason said, trying to make his voice sound more firm, though he was a little wobbly in his heart. Thompson raised his eyebrows, but didn't respond. There was a long silence between the two, as heavy as dark clouds before a storm. Jason knew this was the time to decide. All that he has been through, all that he has fought to keep the trust, will be decided in this moment. He couldn't back down, he couldn't let himself surrender. He will not let Thompson have the opportunity to manipulate him. Once again, Jason thought about Max. Every moment he spent with Max, he knew he couldn't do anything wrong. The dog had put his trust in him, and he couldn't break that trust. He clenched his hands, his eyes not leaving Thompson. "What do you want from me?" Jason asked, but this question was not to find an answer. It was a challenge to see if Thompson could afford to push his limits. Jason was prepared for any situation, and no matter what happened, he wouldn't give up. Thompson nodded slowly, as if he had found something in Jason's words. But Jason couldn't let his complacency take over him. This game is not over yet, and he still has to fight to the end. Every moment, no matter how stressful he is, he must keep his mind and not allow himself to fall. The feeling of tension did not diminish, but multiplied when Thompson nodded silently. Jason senses his opponent's sharp gaze like a thin knife through his outer shell, seeking to pierce and defeat the steadfastness he is trying to maintain. Those moments passed for a long time, and Jason's every breath became a challenge. He could clearly feel the fatigue. His body began to show signs of exhaustion, but his mind was constantly circling with a single thought. Thompson could not be allowed to see weakness. Thompson didn't say anything, but Jason could feel the movement in the air, a subtle but obvious change. His opponent did not ignore any of his small movements. Any reaction could be recognized and taken advantage of. Jason has gone through so many confrontations that he doesn't know that Thompson is playing a psychological game, trying to find his weaknesses through every word, every look. But Jason didn't let anxiety take over. He didn't allow himself to fall into the trap Thompson had set. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions in his heart. The feeling of fatigue became more and more obvious, but he didn't dare to show it. He didn't dare to let any feeling make him weak. Glancing out the window, where the faint light from outside flickered in, Jason realized that he was not only fighting Thompson but also with his own patience. He has trained for too long to maintain his mentality in situations like this. Every decision, every action must be perfect. He had to maintain his unshakable appearance. Thompson lowered his head, as if thinking about something, but his gaze still did not leave Jason, and it made his heart strain. There were no words, but Jason clearly sensed the danger in this space, something like a time bomb ready to explode at any moment. He knew that if he let himself show a little hesitation, if he relaxed a little, it would be time for Thompson to take a chance. "Really? Aren't you afraid of me?" Thompson asked, his tone still challenging but not lacking in mischief. Each question seems to be embedded in it as a challenge, not only wanting to answer but also wanting to see if Jason is strong enough to resist it. Jason felt the tension, but he didn't allow himself to lose his temper. He understood that if Thompson was a little confused, it would be over. It is not allowed to show anxiety, even a little. No, Jason replied firmly, trying to keep his voice steady. Because I know I have a reason to stand here, and you don't. That answer is not only a response to Thompson, but also an affirmation for himself. Jason wanted to remind himself that he wasn't lost in this situation, that he had a purpose, and that purpose would help him get through it all. Although his heart was still a little worried, his eyes did not leave Thompson. He does not allow fear, even the smallest, to creep into his mind. Thompson didn't react immediately, but Jason could feel the change in the air. A tension, a preparation for something that is about to happen. He was waiting, observing Jason's every reaction to find loopholes. But Jason knew that he wouldn't find anything, because he wouldn't let himself be weak in front of his opponents. Every second passed like a test. Jason knew that if he didn't keep his mentality, it would all fall apart. But he couldn't let that happen. He remembered everything that had passed, all he had done to be here, and the only reason he remained standing was because of Max, the loyal dog he had promised to protect. Max is the only hope left, the only friend he can trust in this world. He couldn't let Max down, he couldn't let himself down. Jason clenched his hands again, his fingers almost aching from the tension, but he didn't let go. He will not let himself fail. Not now, not in this fight. The feeling of tension is constantly rising in every moment. Jason clearly felt the change in Thompson's attitude, as if his opponent was cornering him into a corner with no way out. He was not in a hurry, but every question, every look was like a hammer hitting Jason's psychology. But in contrast to Thompson's cold silence, Jason's heart was like a raging fire. Feelings of anger, anxiety, and fatigue blend together, making him feel like he's on a brink. Thompson took a step closer, his eyes still sharp, as if he was looking for the slightest sign of weakness to attack. Jason knew as long as he showed a little worry, a little confusion, he would not hesitate to tear his psychology apart. But in the meantime, a strange thing happened. Although his body was tired, his heart did not flinch. The resilience, the determination to protect everything he had, especially Max, was still the only source of strength that kept him standing. Jason took a deep breath, trying to calm the heat in his heart. He couldn't let anger take over him, because in a psychological confrontation like this, just 1 second of neglect was enough for Thompson to win. He looked directly into his opponent's eyes, trying to maintain a calm appearance, although in his heart it was like a storm was rising. He had to fight a lot to be here, and he couldn't let himself fall at this moment. Thompson still stood there, silent as if observing Jason's every reaction. He didn't seem to be in a hurry, but every second passed like a test for Jason. He knew Thompson was hitting his psychological weakness, piercing the outer shell that he had taken so long to build. And what made him even more nervous was knowing that Thompson was playing this psychological game not only with him, but with himself. He was patient, waiting until Jason showed weakness. "Are you sure you won't fall?" Thompson spoke abruptly, his tone still challenging, but something seemed to carry an implicit excitement. Every word he used had an implication, as if he wanted to break Jason's steadfastness from within. Jason didn't rush to answer immediately, but just kept silent, feeling every beat in his chest. That question, though simple, was like a blow to his mind. He knew it was time to decide. If you let yourself lose your temper, it will all fall apart. But the patience that has been trained throughout the years is helping him maintain his mentality. "No," Jason replied briefly but firmly, "I'm not going to fall." That word is like an affirmation to yourself. Jason not only told Thompson, but also to himself, that he was fully prepared to face everything, whether difficult or dangerous. You can't allow yourself to be a loser, because if you can't protect the most important thing in your life, you're going to lose everything. Thompson did not immediately respond. He just stood there, his face unchanged, but his eyes flashed with mischief. Jason could feel his opponent's patience, as if he was waiting for the slightest mistake to attack. But in that moment, Jason felt his heart stronger than ever. He didn't allow himself to back down. He had gone through so many trials. He couldn't let a psychological game of Thompson bring him down. The two stood there, looking at each other through the dense silent space. Jason couldn't read Thompson's mind, but he knew that he hadn't given up on his intention to defeat him. And so you won't allow yourself to fail. All that remains is a psychological battle, a battle in which no one knows the outcome in advance, but everyone understands that only one person can win. And Jason won't let himself be the loser in this battle. Jason felt like time had stopped. Everything around him had become blurry. Only facing Thompson was clear and sharp, as if all the previous challenges were just a prelude, and this was the decisive moment. The coldness in this room seemed to invade his mind, but in that moment, Jason knew that he couldn't let his anxiety control him. He took a deep breath, trying to dispel the tension that was rising in his heart minute by minute. Thompson took another step. The distance between the two was almost very close. Jason could feel his opponent's breath, and the closer he got, the more obvious the danger became. But the strange thing is, not only is there a threat from the opponent, but there is also a sense of challenge in the way he looks at him. Jason realized that Thompson not only wanted to win, but also wanted to defeat his own resilience. It was the game he wanted to play, and Jason understood that this was not a physical battle, but a battle of steadfastness. The feeling of insecurity began to appear again, but Jason immediately shook his head, telling himself to keep his spirits up. He recalled the times he had overcome challenges before, the times he had to face danger, the times he had to make important decisions. Each time, he felt the strength that came from confidence in himself, in the people he loved, and in the reason he was fighting. That's why he can't fall. He couldn't lose this fight, not just for himself, but for Max, for all he had lost and what he needed to protect. Thompson continued to stare at him, but this time, Jason didn't feel afraid. On the contrary, he felt the confidence from the depths of his mind begin to rise. "Do you think I'll be scared?" Jason thought to himself, a slight smile that didn't appear on his lips but permeated his eyes. Everything is no longer a simple challenge. Every question, every movement of Thompson only increased his determination. This opponent, he thought he could play this psychological game and win, but Jason knows that psychology is the most vulnerable thing when you have absolute calm. With a movement that was not fast, but decisive, Jason stood up straight, his eyes staring directly at Thompson. He didn't let the tension shake him. In fact, he no longer cares about what his opponent thinks of him. Jason knew, in his heart, he had found a weakness that he believed would push him into weakness. But it was that weakness that Jason had learned to face and control. Thompson didn't say anything more, but his eyes seemed to light up, as if he noticed a change in Jason's attitude. He couldn't continue to seek anxiety or fear from him anymore. But as those eyes began to waver, Jason realized that he was the one who had been deceived, not him. He was gnawing on his uncertainty while thinking he was in control of everything. A sense of victory began to creep into Jason's mind, but he knew that this was just the beginning. His confidence is not complacency, but the realization that he is no longer afraid of threat. And this, for Thompson, may have been the biggest shock. Jason won this battle, not because he has overcome questions or psychological games, but because he has found equanimity in himself. In this moment, Jason not only wins the opponent, but also wins himself. Jason stood still, the feeling of victory in his heart becoming more and more pronounced, but he did not allow himself to be lost in that feeling. He knew that this war was not over, and that everything could change in a moment. Although his mind was very stable at this time, his heart was still pounding. Decisions in the next moment could change his whole life. Thompson was still standing across from him, his eyes still full of challenge, but there was something in the way he looked at him that Jason realized that he wasn't as sure as he used to be. A hint of doubt was evident on Thompson's face. Although he remained cold, Jason knew that his steadfastness was being tested. He didn't expect someone like Jason to be able to maintain his composure to this extent. It was he who was struggling in the mess of thoughts. That feeling made Jason less nervous, but at the same time made him more alert. He knew that this was the moment when things could change. To win, it is not just the strength or the ability to reason, but the ability to identify and use the weaknesses of the opponent. Jason realizes that everything is now not just a battle of muscles or intellect, but a battle of subtle psychology. Thompson didn't move, but his eyes swept over every corner of the room, as if trying to break Jason's spirit. A feeling of insecurity rose in Jason's heart again, but this time he didn't let it overwhelm him. He knew it was just a temporary feeling, a subsurface that Thompson had deliberately created to distract him. Instead of reacting, Jason mastered himself, maintaining his posture, without a single superfluous movement. Every move he made at this time was deliberate, without showing any signs of hesitation. There was a long moment of silence. Thompson watched in silence, and then suddenly he walked over to his desk, opened a drawer and pulled out something. Jason felt the atmosphere around him change. Not because of the appearance of that object, but because of Thompson's attitude at this time. He was no longer in control of the game. It was he who was looking for protection, looking for a way to save the situation. Jason was in no hurry to react. He knew that if he wanted to win, he had to wait until the right time. Things are not always as they seem. He could play tricks, but Jason wouldn't let himself be fooled again. Suddenly, Thompson turned around, holding a notebook in his hand. This notebook looks very ordinary, but in this situation, it has an invisible power. Jason knew that in notebooks like this, dangerous secrets could be recorded. But instead of frightening him, it only made his mind clearer. "Jason, do you really want to go to the end of this road?" Thompson spoke up, his voice full of implications. Jason didn't respond immediately. He knew that this was the question Thompson had prepared beforehand, a question not only to test his courage but also to test his resolve. But Jason didn't have to answer. He is ready to face it all. Instead, he just looked Thompson in the eyes, and in those eyes he sent a clear message. "I've come here, and I'm not going to stop." Thompson paused, his eyes scanning Jason again, and then he sighed, as if frustrated at not being able to shake his will. Jason felt a change in his temperament, as if Thompson had lost his confidence. And it was in that moment that Jason knew that he had won part of this battle. But he also knew that this was only a small part of the long fight ahead. Jason can't be subjective, even if everything is in his favor. He felt a surge of mental preparation in his heart, as if this victory was just the beginning of a bigger battle. But one thing is certain, Jason will never turn around.